You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Hello, my name is Jordan Lofthouse, and I'm a senior fellow with the Hayek Program at the Mercatus Center. Today is another installment in our mini-series on economics and the environment. In today's conversation, I'll be talking with Justus Enninga about the intersection of economics, environmentalism, and urbanism. Just to give a brief introduction for Justus, he's a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Economy at King's College London. His research focuses on the intersection of philosophy, politics, and economics. In addition to being a PhD candidate, he also works as the director at Prometheus, which is a classical liberal think tank in Berlin, as well as an economic policy editor for The Pioneer, also in Berlin. He has connections to Mercatus because he's participated in the Adam Smith Fellowship multiple times, so I know him pretty well. I know he's a fascinating person, and so I'm excited to talk to him today. So welcome, Justus.
Thanks so much for the invitation, Jordan. I've been a big fan of the Mercatus content for years, and by far before I came into touch with the Adam Smith Fellowship. So really happy to be here to be on the other side of the content eventually. So that is really cool. So thanks so much for the invitation.
Yeah, to start off, before we get into environmental stuff and urbanism stuff, I want to talk to you a little bit more about your academic background. So I'm curious what sparked your interest in studying political economy, and especially what do you see as the benefit from combining philosophy, politics, and economics as a lens for understanding the world?
Well, as a high school student, I wasn't even that interested in all of the PPE questions, but there's that German government provided a program where you get sent to a developing or emerging country for 12 months, so 1 year, quite the considerable amount of time where you do social service things. I worked in a kindergarten and in an evening school in Southeast India, so close to this main city, Chennai. And this is where my interest in all these philosophy, politics, economics, PPE questions emerged, because being a naive white boy from rural northern Germany going to Southeast India, I had all these stereotypes in my head about developing countries and how they needed help, centralized help through Western societies and all these things, and carrying this thing what William Easterly in his book called the white man's burden, I guess, where you just think you need to be helping others centrally and directed. And being in Southeast India, and living in the Dalit, the untouchable village in India, I just found all these people being so entrepreneurial and driven and ambitious. And then you saw the data of the economic growth that happened that has been happening in India from the 1990s onwards. And then all these questions just emerged in my head, how does that work? Why don't they have a bathroom, but they have a smartphone in their hand? Why are they trading and being entrepreneurial? How does it work that you grow real incomes by 10% each year? And thinking about all these questions of how creative people cooperate with each other and how a government that is retreating actually helps people to become more wealthy. And then all these questions popped up in my head, and you start to read and get amazed about all these PPE questions that are all in the background of these questions. And I started to study something that might be called PPE in English or in the UK or in the US, but in Germany we don't study PPE. It was called Sciences of the State, which might say something about the German approach to philosophy, politics, and economics. but it was basically the same thing. So I started to study that, which was a mixture of these three things. And I thought at some point I would specialize. So I loved economics the most of all these three subjects, but I never, I never actually did. I went on to study political economy in London, and this is where I actually got in touch with what you guys at Mercatus and increasingly the scholarly community call mainline political economy, dealing with the thoughts of from Adam Smith to up to Hayek and Coase, and today the scholars at Mercatus, and worked on the whole question of the embeddedness, the social embeddedness of markets. And I think my master's thesis with Anya Shortland at King's really got my interest sparked, where I worked on Jewish security provision in London and worked with the ultra-Orthodox community in London, led interviews and really did applied mainline political economy research, and just saw how many interesting conclusions you can draw if you use Virginia, Bloomington, and Austrian School of Political Economy thinking in getting new ideas, solutions, conclusions from that. So that really inspired my research. And then I got into the environmental bit, but this is what we're talking about today. But this is kind of the origin story, how I became interested in the PPE questions. So that was a long answer to a short question, but I hope it satisfies.
No, that's great. And I wanna follow up on something you said. I actually had no idea that in Germany they call it sciences of the state, which is fascinating. Which, I mean, I guess, what is political science but a science of the state? But still, I'm wondering, now that you've spent obviously a lot of time in Germany, and now you've spent a lot of time in the Anglosphere, particularly the UK and the US, what, at least in terms of academia and the academic approach, is there a difference in mindset? Like, do you see, like, is there a more, say, liberal approach in the Anglosphere than in Germany? Or is it just, it's not really country based, it's more like institution based, like particular places in the UK might be more, I don't know, centralized planning oriented versus liberal? I don't know. I'd be curious to hear what your experience is being in a bunch of countries at this point.
I honestly believe that there is a difference in culture, how we approach these questions, especially with my experience at King's College London, which is traditionally has been over the last like 10 years maybe, been a very classically liberal minded department where you think about institutions in particular differently to the German PPE or sciences of the state programs, where institutions are naturally associated with the government and with the state and state provided institutions. And I think this is something that I learned in the more liberal Anglosphere, where institutions do not have to be connected to the government necessarily, but are seen as rules of the game for people to cooperate that emerge often spontaneously with no government interference at all, talking about property rights or cultural norms of how to cooperate. And I think that is something that really inspired my thinking about institutions, because coming from Germany, the way we, especially as modern economists, thought about institutions was very much inspired by Acemoglu, Robinson's research on very much like government provided institutions, and no one ever talked about the emergence of institutions or where these institutions might have come from. And this is something that, going to King's College, but also for the last 2 years at NYU and at the economics department there, and with Mercatus, that very much changed. And this is something that you don't very much think about in Germany. Well, obviously there are exceptions and there are great researchers dealing with that, but it is much more common to talk about these issues of the emergence of non-government created institutions in the Anglosphere. So you're absolutely correct there. One point on the sciences of the state, and it's something that, well, obviously you can make fun of as a German because it's so typical for us to associate PPE with the government. But up until now, it's a nice thing to see that a lot of economics departments, especially, are still associated with a department of the sciences of the state, which has nothing to do in particular with government, but with this philosophical approach of philosophy, politics, and economics, that economics actually is embedded into departments that deal with law, with philosophy, and with politics. So that's actually something to say something good about that sciences of the state approach in Germany as well.
No, that's great. I'm curious too, in your experience living and studying in Germany and then the UK, and then, like you mentioned, you have spent some significant time at NYU, and then down in the DC area with us at Mercatus. It seems like you're hinting at some like ideas, like Tocquevillian ideas, these non-state institutions that solve social problems. I guess, at least in your interpretation of Tocqueville's work, do you see something uniquely Tocquevillian about the US? Or do you think Tocqueville's insights are applicable across, all these places that you've lived and studied?
I think the interesting thing is that I chose three very Tocquevillian places to work and study: Germany, the UK, and the US. So, in contrast, for example, to France or Spain, even large parts of Italy, Germany is still a highly federalized state. So every single one of the single Bundesstaaten, Länder, die wir haben, like our states, they are proper governments. So they could basically administer themselves. They have parliaments, they have judiciaries, they have a government, so they could do that on their own. So Germany is this assemblage of different states into one. So that is very similar to the US. Over the course of the 20th century, especially after World War II, that changed and it became more federalized. I think you can see something like that in the UK and the US too. But in contrast to a lot of the European places, it is still highly federalized. What is particular about the US then, and when I went up to see friends, for example, in New York State or somewhere else, which is not like New York City where NYU is, I was amazed by how many things are done locally and administered locally in the United States, especially with regard to things like zoning, local public goods provision, and so on. I know there's a lot of critique about that, but I found all these Tocquevillian ideas in the US, especially concerning local governance, especially in the United States. And that is a big difference to Germany, where there obviously is local governance, and it's very dear and important to us, but it doesn't have the same vibe, and people don't feel the same pride in governing themselves locally as I experienced it in the United States. So I think it's interesting that all these places are known for local governance and federalized government. But in the US, I felt the greatest pride in that. And maybe I'm biased because I've obviously read the Tocquevillian ideas and we are all amazed by Tocqueville's works. And that was directed at the United States. So maybe there's just like rosy glasses that I have on there. But I think that's definitely something that you can feel. But compared to a lot of other places in the West, it's interesting how all these three countries are so highly federalized and kind of Tocquevillian in their idea of the state.
Yeah, and that's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up too, that the US is highly federalized on many, many, many levels. And it comes down to, well, like everything in economics, trade-offs. Like, I'm a big advocate for federalism because I think there are both epistemic benefits and like incentive related benefits to that. But in the US too, it can become kind of burdensome at some degree, which maybe you saw this because, like, of course, like when you have an election in the US, you might be voting on at least 7 or 8 different levels of government at any given point in time. So like there's the federal stuff, there's state stuff, there's county stuff, there's city stuff in which you live. But then there's also like these things that don't comport with any of those. Like you might live in a soil conservation district that you have to vote on, or a water conservation district, or your school district might overlap with a county or a city, but it might not. Like a city might have multiple school districts. So your school district will have and so it's like, that is a bit of a burden for voters to even know what's going on. But again, I guess pros and cons to such a divided system.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, especially, I'm something that I'm really interested in about is cities and how we can make progress happening through building more, not just in cities, but generally in infrastructure regards. And something I think that is similar between the US and Germany, and I know the German example better, is that there are basically 16, 17 different legislative codes on how you can build. So there is no common market in law to build things, for example, a multi-apartment complex in Germany. So there's different laws in the state that I'm from, Berlin, to compare to Bavaria, for example. And then you have all the other 14 states, plus a federal code of how to build. And obviously, this is a huge chaos. You don't have a single market where you can cooperate over borders, because you're subjected to a different code of law there. And obviously, you get the whole argument of a Hayekian competition of different laws, for example, but it also gets like really messy and chaotic, and a lot of politicians and companies demand that there should be like one unified law for how to build things. And even as someone who's sympathetic to classical liberal ideas and the whole idea of an evolutionary process, I sometimes think, man, it would be easier if we just would have one single system and then have the competitive process roll out. I don't know how you feel about that in the US, because I think there's the same problem, especially with regard to zoning, that is very, very localized, I guess.
Yeah, that's true. Zoning is usually super localized, but I think even looking between the states, like you were mentioning, between the US states, there can be huge discrepancies. And so it can be like, if a company wants to move from one state to another, you have to learn a whole new system of laws with a whole new system of regulations. Like, one example I'm thinking of is just like occupational licensing. Let's say you're a public school teacher in one state and you move 3 states over, you might have to get all different kinds of new certifications or things. I mean, there are states that have entered into like compacts with one another where they recognize each other's thing, but that's not all states. And so that can be burdensome. But I guess the other side of that is, well, let's say we just centralize everything and have one approach. If that one approach is good and efficient, well, that's great. But that's a big gamble, because if that one approach is terrible and bad and costly, then everybody suffers. So I guess that's the whole polycentricity argument of, what happens when we don't know the most effective or efficient way to address a social problem? And I guess that's, like you were saying, the Hayekian thing is, if we don't know, we have to experiment, try things out, learn from one another. And so, again, I think it's just a trade-off. I mean, if we're lucky enough to get the right way the first time in a centralized system, well, that's nice. But how many times does that actually happen?
Yeah, I think you're right. And you asked me in the beginning, what is the advantage or the benefit to combine philosophy, politics, and economics? And maybe I sometimes feel that you would need to include history into that too, but I think PPE is already an acronym of 3 words, so a fourth might be too much. But the combination of that approach, what benefited me the most was especially seeing the dynamism of a free economic system and how you want to incorporate change and development and progress into your system of thought, especially if you think about questions of the social science, that as we all do. We both of us do a lot of stuff on the environment or on migration, or even our fellow economists who think about competition, for example, or price theory. And I think a lot of the people who think dynamically about the world incorporated ideas of philosophy, politics, and history into their approaches, and did not just think through it through the one lens of one of each of these things, but saw that if we want to incorporate change into our system, we need to consider all these different approaches. Obviously, there are trade-offs there too, because if you deal with all these things, you can't delve into one of them as deeply as you might have wanted to. But I think to see the world in all its complexity and its capability to change, it's important to combine all of them. And I think that benefited my research a lot and helped me a lot to incorporate all these things to see change and dynamism. And I think that's something you pointed out very correctly.
Yeah, I know we've been talking a little bit about polycentricity, and now we're hinting at kind of complexity and environmental things. I want to switch now to, I guess, really the meat of what we wanted to talk about. I want you, kind of to describe what you see as the connection between cities or urbanism in general to environmental outcomes. And so I think kind of counterintuitively, a lot of people see cities as like these dirty, gross places. But interestingly, cities are actually like per capita much greener, greener in the sense like more environmentally friendly in a lot of ways than non-urban areas. So yeah, do you want to just walk us through what your thinking is, your big picture thinking is on urbanism and the environment?
Yeah, let me give you a little story that I'm really happy about telling every time when I talk to Americans about that topic, because I think Americans and Germans are very similar in that regard too, because they're a little skeptical of cities, which is why I love to go to Italy and Spain, because these are what I would naively say are city nations, while Germans and Americans are kind of skeptical about that. But at the same time, especially Americans love Henry David Thoreau, which is especially in classical liberal circles known for his book on civil disobedience. But he was also a staunch environmentalist with his book Walden, for example. And in 1844, so mid-19th century, the young Thoreau fled from the noise and the dirt. You described that quite pointedly, of the city to the countryside, because he wanted to spend some undisturbed hours in the deep expanses of the New England forest. And he wanted to enjoy the nature and made himself comfortable and lit a campfire. But instead of doing something good for himself and for nature by sitting there and making a campfire, his fire spread to the neighboring treetops, sparking this major fire and destroying more than a square mile of untouched nature. And then he had to return to the city again to do something good for nature. Just do not go into nature if you want to save nature. And this is a story that I didn't come up myself, but Edward Glaser, who's a very famous urban economist at Harvard University, but I still love that story, especially with that American connotation that everyone loves Thoreau. And I think it's a good story to tell that I believe it's a typical argument for unintended consequences, where people think that they do something good and that they do something good for nature by being in nature. But I think that if we consider the environmental impact of each individual human being, it is way better in the city. And you can see that in one example for if you consider a map of the northeast of the United States and consider the carbon emissions per capita there. And you have these huge expanses of red on that map, which is colored, which is the rural parts of the northeastern United States, which shows that people produce up to 62 tons of carbon per household. Then you see all these little green dots on that map, which are the urban areas of New York City, Philadelphia, Baltimore, DC, and even Richmond in Virginia. Because the people living there produce far less, to about 15 tons of carbon emissions per household, because they live in very dense urban areas. And the reason for that is they produce fewer carbon emissions because they consume less of carbon-intensive goods. Because they live so closely to each other and in such dense urban area that they, for example, do not need a car. They use public transport. They do not live in a huge mansion, but in a small apartment, or maybe even a huge penthouse, but still way smaller and less carbon intensive than a whole house that you need to heat or cool down. If you live in Virginia, for example, summers in New York City can be exhaustingly hot too. So, but you need to spend less energy on your daily needs. That is just the carbon emissions. You can make the same argument about land use. Every one of us love the expanse and pristine nature around the cities, but they often get, especially that kind of nature, gets destroyed by suburban sprawl. I think that is nothing particularly new to say, but I think it's important to emphasize that if you live in dense urban areas where you build vertically and you have a lot of people living on just 1 square mile, you do not need that space somewhere in suburbia outside of a city. For example, in Manhattan, you have 75,000 people living there per square mile. Just imagine having all these people living in a detached single family unit, or even just a semi-detached unit in suburbia. They would use up like huge amounts of beautiful, untouched nature. So if you really want to do something for nature, you might want to consider living in Manhattan. And that's something that I did quite often. To just like, I lived in the East Village, and after that was like very, very expensive. So I moved up to Harlem, and I did frequent trips up to upstate New York. And it took me an hour train ride, and I was in untouched nature, and I could come back and be in the city again. So I think if you break it down to a pure Econ 101 efficiency standpoint, it is just so much more efficient to have people live close to each other because they need fewer resources, infrastructure, and so on per person. I think that's the Econ 101 argument for that. So obviously there are other environmental problems too attached with cities. So there's, for example, more damage through small particulate matter. For example, if you drive cars through a city, they produce this particulate matter from the wheels that get rubbed, or from the emissions from the cars. That is obviously a problem. And you have noise emissions, which might be better in suburbia or in your villa somewhere outside the city. But I think cities can handle that, and cities are no panacea. So we're talking about polycentricity the whole time, and I think cities are a comparatively good arrangement for us to live in when we want to live environmentally friendly. But obviously there are no, this is not like the panacea that gives us all the solutions. But I think it's a highly underrated framework of living environmentally friendly. I think that would be my case for the city as a green space.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. Well, yeah, and I completely agree that cities are not a panacea. And I guess you can elaborate or push back if you think this is wrong, but I think it's maybe important to emphasize that there's not just one type of city. Cities can come in a whole bunch of different types of arrangements and have a huge range of different policies. So, yeah, comparing, say, like New York City to Houston almost couldn't be more different in a lot of ways, in terms of infrastructure, well, even climate. So like Houston has to deal with different types of climate than New York City does. Like New York in the winter can have huge snowstorms. You don't really ever hear of snow ever in a place like Houston. But even just in terms of, what they want to do, Houston is, famous or infamous for not having zoning or having very weak zoning. Whereas New York, if a building's more than 30 years old, it's a historic building. I mean, that's an exaggeration, obviously, but, it's really hard to build anything in New York. And so, yeah, it's cool to see that, in terms of polycentricity, a lot of different cities can exist and they can try different things. Some have better public transportation than others. Some have other, different types of regulations like air emissions regulations or what have you.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And my case for the city relies on these very dense urban cities like New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, parts of Washington, D.C. And you see my case for the city to some extent crumbling, of course, if you consider places like Los Angeles, for example. But if you're very harsh on LA, you might even say, well, is that really a city, or is it just houses put next to each other, connected by roads and the car. Obviously, it's built on. There are a lot of roads, there are a lot of houses, but people do not live in the same proximity as they do in the classical European style city, or even in New York City and Boston and Philadelphia. But I think a lot of people would intuitively say that life in New York City, Boston, or Philadelphia is more the style of urbanism that they like. They would call the East Village in New York City, for example, or Greenwich Village in New York City, a nice urban space, while they wouldn't say the same thing about Los Angeles, I guess. And you see it in the environmental record too, that cities like Houston or Los Angeles are far worse in their environmental track record compared to the highly to the dense urban spaces at the East Coast. So these cities are all very different, and I think that is the exciting thing about dealing with urbanism, that all these cities are so different and in a polycentric approach are in a competition with each other. And I think that is a very interesting, especially from the perspective of the social science, a very exciting thing to see, because you can make like almost real life experiments with these different cities, because they're all like particular urban spaces, but they change over time depending on the institutional framework that they are embedded in. So I think that is a very, very exciting thing to do research on.
Yeah, and as you were thinking too, and describing kind of these different cities, I've spent quite a bit of time in Tokyo, and Tokyo I find is a fascinating place. Still the world's biggest city, very dense. Even though there's not that many tall buildings in Tokyo, it's just 10 to 20 story buildings as far as the eye can see for miles and miles and miles and miles. And what's interesting there is they have a very different conception of zoning than, say, the American sense. Whereas in most American cities, it's like this area is for single family homes where people live. This area of town is for industry. This area of town is for commercial. So if you want to go shopping, you have to drive across town from the residential part to the commercial part and do what you need to do. But in Tokyo, it's fascinating because you could live your whole life in a 3 or 4 block radius, because like on the ground floor, you'll have maybe a grocery store, a dentist office, a daycare. And then above that, you'll have maybe some offices. And above that, you'll have apartments. And so you can easily get around where you need to do or what you need to do. And there's also, a really good public transportation system. So, and shockingly, Tokyo, while expensive, is not as expensive as some places or some people might expect compared to other cities. Like, I mean, New York is just astronomically expensive, but it doesn't necessarily have to be.
No, it doesn't. And I think Tokyo is a prime example of how good urbanism works out. And there are so many books and research currently about the 15-minute city. So where city planners are supposed to build a city where everyone can reach all the necessities of life, a kindergarten or the workplace or the bakery, or in my case, like a cozy bar within 15 minutes. And I'm just thinking, and you look at the European cities and at the dense urban places on this world, and you think, we already have that. It's it's the classical, traditional, dense city that was never properly planned from the top down, but was the result of entrepreneurs, consumers, citizens acting on their own economic self-interest and their partnerships, and like spontaneously from the bottom up creating that city, because it's obviously the better way to live in a city if you can reach everything that you need in life within 15 minutes. And now there are a lot of big plans, and especially city planning loves to plan, obviously, and they want to plan the 15-minute city. And you're just kind of in awe how they could not see that the 15-minute city is already in place, but it was never planned, but was the result of all these city dwellers and how they acted in cooperation with each other. So I think there's a great classical liberal mainline political economy point to be made, how the 15-minute city actually developed. And I think especially because I learned so much from you, Jordan, too, about polycentricity, it doesn't necessarily have to be private actions by private individuals that create the 15-minute cities, but government, and especially local government, has some space there too. Especially in Berlin, for example, the part of Berlin where I live in has historically been a kind of out of town suburbia of Berlin. But the Prussians at the end of the 19th century actually built a public transport train in a circle around Berlin and around the neighborhood that I live in, and that actually took in these outskirts of town into the city center, because suddenly the costs and the time costs traveling there were reduced so much by that new public transport that a lot of people moved there and new industry developed, and government actually created a very important public good there locally. And then all the other entrepreneurs, citizens, consumers came in, because government used its resources locally to reduce costs for people moving there and living there. And I think that is an interesting example of local governance plus private actions of city dwellers that actually create this dense urban life that a lot of people love. And you see that people voting with their feet. They do not visit Houston per se as a touristy trip, I guess, but they go to Paris and Rome and London and Berlin and Tokyo because they like that urban density that was created spontaneously with a little help of local government, I think.
Yeah, I'm curious. So I don't mean to make this focus too much on American cities, but in what you just described between, like, say, London, Paris, Berlin, throw Tokyo in there, these very dense places where a lot of people live in the downtown, very commutable, compared to most American cities. I know the American cities we've been focusing on are kind of like the four big ones on the East Coast, like Boston, New York, Philly, and DC. But I feel like those four American cities are actually kind of unique in the landscape of America. I'm thinking of a lot of other, kind of mid-sized cities in the US, places like, I don't know, Indianapolis, Columbus, Des Moines, Minneapolis, like you name it. Those have a very different layout, structure. I mean, they're just really spread out. Do you have thoughts on, like, why it is that American cities are so different from, say, their European counterparts?
Yeah, I think in the urbanism literature, a lot of the literature, largely, and I think the argument makes sense, is that the car is at fault, where you would say that the traditional European cities and Tokyo and the older American cities on the East Coast were largely developed while there were no cars. So even in downtown Manhattan, Midtown Manhattan, people had to go by feet. They had to take horses or lorries that were like carried by horses. And then public transport came along at first, and then only in the mid 20th century the car developed. And you see that in New York City, that the city shape changed because they built more highways and things like that. But the general city structure stayed the same. It's still a mess to take a car through the very narrow New York City East Village streets, but it made that very dense urbanism happen. Cities like Houston and LA, which are historically younger, really saw their growth in times when the car was already there or so close at the horizon that city planners actually said, well, the car is going to be at the center of individual transport, so let's design our city according to the car. And that made these cities so distinct. And you see that in 20th century Germany, but also in New York City, for example. I know New York City the best. That's why I'm talking about New York City the whole time. Is that city planners actually try to destroy the layout of the very urban and pedestrian focused layout of New York City to make it more suitable for cars. And urbanists like Jane Jacobs, for example, really fought that because she saw the car-centric vision of city planners, especially around Robert Moses in the United States, as a prime example of very damaging central planning. She saw cities as this spontaneously developed, citizens-focused place that came out of no central plan, but out of individual actions of the citizens. And then the central planners came around and said, the car is going to be our new mode of transport. So we will change that, and we'll change that from the top down, destroying a lot of neighborhoods and destroying a lot of social situations and social environments, especially within minority neighborhoods, because in the 1960s, that was the easiest thing to destroy, to build new highways. And that is a whole new topic. But I think coming back to your question, and I kind of got carried away, so sorry about that, is I think the car is the reason why so many American cities look so different to the East Coast cities and European cities.
It's kind of hard to go back and change history. Do you have thoughts on what American cities can do now that aren't kind of the older East Coast cities? Like what does an Indianapolis or a Des Moines or a Denver do now to improve its urbanism in a way that's more environmentally friendly?
I think there's a lot of like really exciting research on there for everyone who's interested. Stronger Towns, I think, is the name of a very cool American startup think tank that deals with these questions. And I think taking back a lot of the zoning requirements is one way to go, because I think people want to live close to each other because there are so many more benefits to the city, not just environmentally. It would be an unintended consequence, the environmental bit, and the intended consequence of people moving to the cities because they can get richer, real incomes are higher. They want to do that, but you need to allow them to do that. And especially in a lot of American cities, zoning is just so harsh, and you pointed that out, that people want to live close to where they work. So you want to have neighborhoods where you can live, you can work, you can have fun, and want to combine that. And a lot of zoning requirements in the US prevent that from happening. The other thing is that you need to allow higher buildings in particular, and building denser neighborhoods that are not focused on the car. So there are a lot of requirements that buildings need to be close to a road that is where cars can drive, where cars can park, you have parking requirements and all these things. And I think what makes cities attractive, and especially economically attractive in the European, but also at the northeastern American cities, is that things can be reached quickly by pedestrians. And I think taking away parking and car requirements and easing zoning will help to make cities more attractive for people to develop closer, more dense neighborhoods, and people will move there because it's in their rational self-interest to do so. And if people don't want to do that, they can still live in the countryside, so there's no force there, but just make it easier to live and build in the city, and the dense neighborhoods will follow automatically, I think.
So, not to be too controversial, but I guess, would you argue that both zoning laws and these mandatory parking minimums in the US are anti-environmental laws?
Oh yeah, I 100% believe so. To make an even hotter case is that I believe that suburbia actually is an anti-environmental form of living. So in my dream scenario, there would be amazing cities like Tokyo, Berlin, and New York City, and very nice rural countryside villas and Airbnbs and hotels, but nothing in between. And I think that would be environmentally the most friendly. And I think there would be if we would ease zoning and parking requirements, more people would decide on either living in the city or living in the proper countryside. And I grew up in the countryside. I love that. But I see that if everyone wants to live in the countryside, no one will live in the countryside because it will be suburbia all over the place. And nothing really, not the real countryside, not real city. So I think you're absolutely right that parking requirements, zoning laws that eventually led into suburbia are anti-environment. Yes.
Yeah, that even reminds me, because I grew up in a small town in Idaho, And like, I know before you had mentioned about the efficiency, like the environmental efficiency factor of when you don't have to commute very far, there's fewer, carbon emissions, there's fewer particulate matter, emitted. And for me, I remember we would have to drive from my small town in Idaho to Salt Lake City to go to like a real mall, to go to a mall that had like multiple stores to buy clothes instead of, like our little tiny local mall that had only a few stores. And we had to drive 250 miles one way to get to this mall. And so it's like we have to make, a 500-mile round trip journey to go to like an actual sizable size like mall to go shopping. And I know that's probably not the majority of Americans, but there's a pretty big chunk of Americans that live in rural places that where you have to drive so far to get really anything done, which is kind of shocking. Yeah, I'm wondering too what you think of as, besides the environmental benefits of cities, what other benefits of cities are there? Like, on what margins are cities outperforming kind of suburbs or rural areas? I would imagine that, there's economic benefits. What do you think about that?
Oh yeah. So I don't want to make the impression as if I came up with that on my own. So I heavily depend on the work of the aforementioned Professor Glaser, and he wrote that great book, Triumph of the City, how our greatest invention made us richer, smarter, healthier, greener, and happier. So for reading that title, you might think about cities as a panacea because it does so many good things to people. And because I think cities are underrated, I try to emphasize that point a lot. And I think the most important point for individuals is that cities make us richer. And the reason for that is what economists call agglomeration effects. And that is the positive economic effect and even the positive externality of having a lot of smart, ambitious people very close to each other. So if Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Edison, and maybe even Daimler and Bosch were just like living together in one place, and maybe one multi apartment complex in downtown Manhattan, and they would talk with each other, they would experiment with each other, they would have ideas with each other. Great things would happen, and much greater things compared to when these people would just be living alone in their small villa somewhere in the countryside. So if you bring together a lot of smart people, their ideas will start to, and I think it was the author Matt Ridley who said that these ideas will start having sex, and we'll get kids, and we'll get more kids, and we'll have more ideas. And that is what makes cities so economically powerful. And you can see that throughout history. You can see that in Manchester, Liverpool, and London during the Industrial Revolution. You can see that in New York City, and with regard to finance. And you can see that now in California, for example, where around San Francisco and the Bay Area, you had an agglomeration of very smart, ambitious people with venture capital, and they created great things that changed the world. And while that might sound a little like economically, you can still see that in the plain statistics, that if you move to New York City, for example, your income will grow dramatically. Of course, cities are also more expensive, but even compared to the highest standard of living and what you have to pay for your standard of living, it still makes sense for people to move into the city. And you see that in the statistics too, that a lot of people want to move into cities, even in developed nations like the United States or Germany, and only a few city people actually want to move out into the countryside. So I think the economic reason is a strong one for cities. And another argument that Edward Glaser makes, well, it makes a smarter argument because, as I said before, we can hang around with a lot of smart people, and we can concentrate our scarce resources on very good schools in the city center, and you have a whole societal mix of kids going into these schools. And that is an argument that can be made, especially about the economic rise of Germany, for example, in the late 19th century, that you had very dense cities like Cologne, Hamburg, Berlin, where you had a mix up of different kids from different economic backgrounds going to the same schools and combining their ideas and getting ahead together, basically. And I think that is something that is similar to the origin story of New York City too, where you had different economic backgrounds in downtown Manhattan that got along with each other and cooperating with each other to make their cities, to make themselves smarter, and then make their cities richer. A third argument is the health argument, and I think that is something that is sometimes a little counterintuitive to people as well, because they think, well, we are in the countryside, so it's so much healthier. But perhaps people in the countryside would be more healthy than city dwellers if they still would like do a lot physical demanding labor and eat fresh fruits and vegetables from the field. But this is not the case anymore. People who live in the countryside also work in offices and don't work out enough. They go to some discounter and eat processed food. So that doesn't apply anymore. But if you live in a city, you just move more. And I experienced that moving to New York City, that my Apple Health statistics just went through the roof because I just walked 10 kilometers, which is maybe 8 miles, I think, per day, just because that was the thing that I had to do. I went to the NYU campus. I went to my favorite bagel store. I went to get a cappuccino. I went to meet with friends. And you just walk the whole time. And that's something that is very, very healthy. And you can see that in all health statistics, that you don't need to do crazy workouts to be fit and healthy, but do regular physical movements. And people in the city do that. And that's the easiest option to stay healthy. And that's why cities even make us more healthy, with the caveat that we already talked about, that there are also detrimental health effects from cars in dense urban area, of course, but in total and in sum, it still makes us healthier.
Yeah, and I was just going to throw in another plug. I know you mentioned The Triumph of Cities by Edward Glaeser. The other one, another book that I recently read that I thought was very fascinating is by Enrico Moretti, The New Geography of Jobs. And he actually talks a lot about this, how these agglomeration effects that you mentioned in certain cities, there's like this very interesting synergy that happens when you put people close to each other and like their ideas combine, and it makes the individuals more productive, but then it makes the whole society more productive overall. And so he talks about kind of the Bay Area. Even in the Bay Area, even people in kind of low skill jobs are more productive than other places. So like, somebody like a janitor or something, they actually make significantly more than they would in another place, just because the people there around are also so much more productive. And so that's why we see kind of a divergence, at least within the United States. I don't know if we can make this generalization for other places, but in the United States, there are kind of these hubs of productivity that are becoming like super productive, while other places are kind of languishing behind, and they're having a hard time keeping up, which I think for, kind of normative reasons, there's a concern there, but it's not immediately apparent what we should do, if there's any like policy prescription that can really be done to solve that. But I guess one thing that is very interesting, I suppose, throughout American history and even to today, is the mobility of Americans. Americans just move a lot. Like, I live 2,000 miles from where I grew up. Americans move all the time. And so maybe that's part of it too, is there are cities that are, I mean, back in the day, you think of the 1950s, Detroit was a boom town. If you wanted to be rich, you moved to Detroit. Right now, Detroit, Detroit's been shrinking for 40, 50 years, I think, in terms of population. It's not what it used to be, but, San Francisco's booming. We see all the, Austin, Texas is booming. So maybe that's one bit of a upside to, this new geography of jobs.
Yeah, I think there's this like really interesting paper from the early 2010s where the researchers analyzed how much growth the USA forwent because they didn't invest enough into building more residential units in their 3 to 4 top cities, New York City, Austin, the Bay Area, and it was 1/3. So the US could be way richer if they would have invested more into cities because individuals, even in low skilled jobs, are so much more productive than anywhere else. And I think it's an interesting policy proposal, not just to look at tax rates and regulation in the labor market, but also have a look at cities and how cities contribute to growth, and deregulating cities to actually spark more growth. It's a case that is hard to communicate because it's counterintuitive and people do not connect city growth with economic growth immediately. But I think it would be very important to spark a very sustainable path to growth in the future. Definitely, yes.
It's great. I know we've been talking for a while now. I want to switch gears just a little bit to talk about some of your other research that you've been working on that is also environmental related. So you've written on adapting to climate change through migration. And I'm just curious how you would describe the way that you think about that relationship between climate change and migration.
Yes, that is a piece of work that I've been working on for quite some time now, and it still engages me intellectually a lot. And I worked on that with your colleague Nathan Goodman, who was a colleague of mine at NYU as a postdoc. And the way we think about it is that climate change is real, it is happening, and it will have tremendous consequences on individual lives, especially in the global south. You need to think about it that way, that right now there's only 1% of the world's surface that is considered what the research calls a hot zone. So places where the temperature is far beyond the 30 degrees Celsius, where life is barely possible. And in 2070, this number of hot zones is expected to grow to nearly 20%. And from that on, a lot of research argues, well, that means a lot of lives will be lost, a lot of problems will emerge for the people there. And our research argues that, talking about dynamism and change, that people are not stupid and people are an adaptive species that will do something about it. And these people that live in these in the future barely habitable hot zones will adapt to some degree. Some will invest into ACs and into better buildings and so on. But since these hot zones will be largely in the global south, which is very poor and where people will not have enough resources to invest into adaptation locally, they will do something else. They will move. They will try to get to the global north, where the temperatures are still way cooler. So more and more people will move to the global north. And our research is how, as people who live in the global north, who do research in the global north, how will the institutional setup of the global north react to that? Because as we see, we are not considerably capable of dealing with that question in a good way. And this is something that applies to the southern border in the United States, but also to the southern borders of the European Union and the Mediterranean, where a lot of people already want to move into our countries. And our institutional setup tries to stop people from doing that, because we see migrants and climate migration as a national security problem, basically. And that is something that we in our research take issue with as coming from this mainline tradition of political economy, because whenever you frame something as a national security problem, you usually require national, centralized, top-down solution, which are usually highly centralized, bureaucratic, and often militarized, as you can see in the example of the United States, where the Department of Defense and Homeland Security does a lot on migration. What we argue in our research is that migration actually is a very complex problem, and that we need to think about how do you usually deal with complex questions and what types of institutions you need to enable actually effective adaptation in the global north to the growing influx of migrants. And we would argue that modeling climate migration as a national security problem and then national solutions will run into the same problem as national solutions to economic problems, top-down economic problems. Hierarchical solutions of economic problems has not gone down well in the past, and even mainstream scholars and scholars on the left and on the right would now agree that solving complex economic questions through highly centralized means will run to a lot of knowledge and incentive problems. And we believe the same thing applies to immigration. If we have more people coming into the United States or Europe and we impose national immigration restrictions, that will run into the same knowledge and incentive problems as economic planning. And in our research, we basically spell out the different forms of knowledge and incentive problems that emerge from climate migration, which is dealt with through centralized government means. And we try to approach that question with a polycentric approach and show how markets, civil society, community governance can actually solve the problem of climate migration, not in a perfect way, because the world is not perfect, but we'll do that in a comparatively better way than highly centralized solution, because the decentralized polycentric solution deals with knowledge and incentive problems in a far superior way.
So I'm curious, based on that answer, what you think of, let's say, over the next few decades. These hot zones increase. A large number of people from the global south need to move into the global north, say the US, Canada, the European Union. I can imagine, too, there might be quite a few tensions between the people who already live there and people who are migrating in. Do you have thoughts on maybe the best ways to accommodate large influxes of people into, say, the global north?
So you're absolutely right that there will be people, and there's already are, who do not want to take in any more migrants. But, and that is something that is not very much discussed, but we see the high demand for people from the global south because our economies in the global north are aging. We send a lot of people into retirement, but still we are big economies who need a huge labor force. We need new ideas. We need new entrepreneurship. There's a high demand for additional people. So in the United States, for example, we see that there are regions who are far more willing to take in migrants than other regions. So, for example, if in New York City or the Bay Area wants to take in more migrants because they say we need an influx in labor for our labor force, or we are aging, so we need more people coming in to make our labor force younger, they can take in these people while other regions might not have to take them in. And obviously that is a challenging proposition that we put forward, because there will be regions who try to stay homogeneous, who want to stay white, Christian, homogeneous. And I think it doesn't take a lot of fantasy to imagine that to happen in the US, but also in Europe. But there are also regions who really demand and require additional people and who would be happy to take them in. Well, that would require a truly polycentric framework where you have different and autonomous regions and local regions that can take in people and regions that can say autonomously, we do not want to take in people. And I think that's why our proposal is challenging, because it requires a greater diversity in institutional arrangements. But compared to the realistic alternative that we have, and I think that's important to not compare idealized solutions to the real world that are just pure fantasy to the real world. I think the real world alternative is to stop migration altogether. And that is what's about to happen. If in Europe the right wing comes into power, or in the US, there will be just a stop to immigration, or or the amount of people coming in will be lowered completely for everyone. So I would be far more happy with the non-ideal situation of having different places in the US and Europe where people come in and other people where they cannot, compared to the alternative of not letting people in completely or lowering the number drastically for everyone.
Yeah, and that seems to be kind of the bridge between the two halves of our conversation, is this climate change and migration issue with the kind of urbanism and polycentricity issue. Is when you can have, say, certain cities or certain urban areas really want maybe an influx of labor, they could let those people in there. Well, other places, maybe not. I suppose in a federalist system, though, that does make it a little complicated. Whereas, like within the EU and within the US, we have freedom of movement. So once somebody is in, and let's say they move to New York and they decide in 5 years to move to a different place, they can't be stopped. And so I could see maybe a skeptic of your claim pushing back against that. Would you have an answer for them?
I think that is one of the best arguments against that, especially because it accepts the axioms that I, as a scholar who likes to talk about mainline political economy and classical liberalism, actually has. When I like freedom of movement across borders. But if that means that within the system where we have freedom of movement, the United States, one centralized position, the presidency, for example, can simply decide on who comes into the place and who doesn't, I might find the situation of less movement within superior, because it allows me to have my own setup of ideas and economic system within. And I think both of that is not perfect. I would obviously ideally I would prefer something else, more liberal, more free. But in that imperfect world that we live in, I might prefer less freedom of movement in the inside, but I can decide to take in people from Mexico in the US example when I am New York City, or take in people from Syria or Northern Africa into Berlin if I wanted to do that. I know that's a hot take that you might push back against. I wonder about your thought, because I know you're generally sympathetic to our argument, but considering what you just said, what would be your position on that? I'm curious.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know, because I think there are a lot of benefits to polycentricity in that obviously different places have, I mean, again, I'm a methodological individualist. Individual people have their own preferences, but there are prevailing cultural preferences between different places. So within the US, say Utah is not Vermont. Your average voter in Utah has very different preferences than your average voter in Vermont. And I'm sure it's the same between, say, like, I know, even France and Germany, even though they border each other. I'm sure, your average German,
definitely.
Yeah. And that's why I see polycentricity, especially federalism, as beneficial in that on many margins, these different places can have different policies that fit the prevailing sentiments of the people there. Whereas, other places can cater to their other, prevailing preferences. And like you said, I also am a big advocate for freedom of movement, because I think that's both, like, just in the, cold hard economics, allowing people to move allows people to be more productive and people get richer, and that's better. But then also in just like a normative sense, like people should have the right to move where they want to move, especially within the United States as a unit, or the European Union as a unit. People should be able to move. Now, again, I can imagine certain places with prevailing sentiments getting fed up with maybe a large influx of people who they view as different. maybe a bit of xenophobia, maybe a lot of bit of xenophobia, which I do not agree with. I think that's a bad thing. How do we deal with that? I guess that's where I put hope in a meta-polycentric structure where I would hope that, like civil society organizations would help ease tensions, would help, diverse groups of people see each other as equals. I think that's definitely one strength of the United States historically has been, our melting pot culture. I know there's been a lot of criticisms of the idea and the metaphor of melting pot, but the US has so many different types of people that were historically enemies that are now essentially not enemies at all. So I think over time, people can learn to live together better than they would otherwise. And that's why I think the benefit of polycentricity is markets help people learn to live better. Civil society does. A polycentric governance arrangement allows people to do that. My only worry is an influx of too many migrants too fast might be difficult for people to acclimatize to. Whereas if obviously everything's on a spectrum. So there has to be kind of some sweet spot where we can allow in a large number of people, where we don't allow in so many people all at once that, the tensions break. I don't know if you have any thoughts or responses to that, but
yeah, I think you put a nice bracket to our environmentalism, city, and migration conversation here, and I want to do that too because I think for me, the prime beauty example of the United States is the time of the late 19th century up until the highly restrictive 1920s reforms in the US, and how many people actually influxed into especially Manhattan and New York City, and how many people you had living together who came together with different skin colors, different cultures, different religions, backgrounds, etc., living, and they didn't even spread out like completely over the United States, but they decided to live together in downtown Manhattan. And you had all these conflicts going on, but you had the German beer house next to the Italian pizzeria and the Jewish, Polish, Ashkenazi food breakfast shop, and all together. And I still find it curious how, even though they were in such stark conflict with each other, and you had violent conflict between the different groups, they still did not decide in large swaths to move out, because this would not have been a problem. You could have just moved out of New York City and went somewhere where you had your own place. And a lot of people did that. You have all your different minorities spread all over the United States, but a lot of people actually, in spite of all the conflict, decided to live together in New York City. So I'm still hopeful that, considering climate migration and the large influx of people, that it is possible to live together even among all the tensions, and that we should be cautious to tread down the argument of it might destroy the American institutional setup or the European setup if too much migrants come in, because there's a great example of New York City in the 1890s where a lot of people came in, and they were very different and there were tensions, but it actually provided the seed of the future success of the United States. So I think that is the hopeful bracket for the whole conversation, I guess, where I think it might still be possible to live that kind of American way of life, even with a large influx of climate migrants.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to leave our conversation. Justus, thank you so much for talking with me today. And, I'm excited to see your future work.
Thank you so much, Jordan, for the invitation.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.